In this video, we're going to continue with triangle proofs. So in the previous section, we were working on how to prove two triangles congruent, and we had our different methods. We had side, 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 so we proved the three sides of one were congruent to the three sides of another. Then we had side, angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, and depending on what class you may have talked about hypotenuse legs. So we have these 5 different methods for proving that two triangles are congruent. So now, once we prove that triangles are congruent, each of these methods uses 3 pieces of information. Now that the triangles are congruent, we know that the other 3 pieces of information are congruent. So what we're saying here is that the corresponding parts of these triangles we just proved congruent are also congruent. So let's take a look at what we've got here. In the following diagram, we have triangle ABC congruent to triangle DEF. Mark corresponding parts of each triangle that are congruent, then list them below. So this is a little warm-up for us. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video and then mark all 6 parts of each triangle and then list off the congruent parts. So go ahead and pause the video now and do that. So here I've got the 2 triangles marked with tick marks. Notice I've highlighted the corresponding vertices. So A and D correspond, C and F correspond, and then B and E correspond. And we can also get that information from the triangle congruency statement. Remember, since A is in the first spot, that matches with D in the first spot. So notice I have A and D both highlighted the same color. Alright, so here's the tick marks. You could have had different tick marks. Doesn't matter what tick marks you have as long as each of the sides match. We're missing a couple here, so let's put those in. Alright, and then here's a list of the corresponding sides, and here's a list of the corresponding angles. If you need to pause so you can go ahead and check those, go ahead and do that. So since we knew that the triangles were congruent up here, we also knew that all of these pairs of corresponding sides and corresponding angles were also congruent. Alright, so if you know that two triangles are congruent, you can use the definition of congruent triangles to conclude that corresponding parts are congruent. So we've got CPCTC, which again stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so notice we take the first letter of each word. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. Make sure you remember what CPCTC stands for. That's very important. And let's continue on to this last example before we end this video. So given the diagram at the right, Y is triangle NML congruent to triangle WMY. So let's take a look. We've got a pair of sides congruent in LM and YM, and we have a pair of segments congruent in NM and WM. And we also know that these vertical angles are congruent. So we know that these triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. So we use 3 pieces of information here, 2 pair of sides and a pair of angles to get the triangles congruent. Once we've shown that the triangles are congruent, which other parts of the triangles must be congruent if the triangles are congruent now? Well, we know that this angle up here is going to have to be congruent to this angle down there. Since the triangles are congruent, angle N is going to be congruent to angle W. And we also know that angle L is going to be congruent to angle Y. Angle L congruent to angle Y. And lastly, we know that segment NL is going to be congruent to segment WY. Segment NL congruent to segment WY. Why must the parts above be congruent? Well, since the triangles were congruent, the corresponding parts are congruent, or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so we're still going to be proving triangles congruent, but now instead of that being our last step, we're going to continue with one more step. So you have to pay very close attention to what you're trying to prove and solve it appropriately. All right, so that's it for this video. If you had any questions or need to rewind and rewatch, feel free to do that. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video.